Guys, it's me. I've been putting this off long enough, and putting it off is not really even the right. I've been busy, and I'm sorry, but you know what? Finally, here we are. We're gonna round out the series of original Star Trek films with Star Trek Six. So, hi, for those of you just joining us, I'm CK Burch. This is my geek review of Star Trek Six: The Undiscovered Country. And once upon a time, as I said in some of my other reviews, I used to consider this the best of the original Star Trek films, or at least the one that stuck in my mind the most. Certainly, The Wrath of Khan is the most beloved because it gave that shot in the arm to the new series of movies, all while referencing the past while moving forward into the future with a brand new look, direction. The Wrath of Khan is a very rare film for a franchise to undergo because it is an absolute revitalization and at the same time respect for the past and reference of the past. It just did so many things right that it's kind of hard to top. And you've got Research for Spock, you've got the Star Trek 4 Voyage Home with the Whales, and then you've got a Final Frontier, which not everybody really likes, but I actually kind of really enjoyed. Star Trek 5 is an underrated picture. Or, yes, underrated picture, I think. But we're at Star Trek 6. And Star Trek 6, to me, still holds up as the best. Just barely the best. The original Star Trek films. Now, for me, what makes it the best of the Star Trek films is that, like The Wrath of Khan, it definitely references the past, and sorry, my phone will go off, so I decided to mute it. I know it's going to go off. But at the same time, what it does is it brings to close an entire character arc. We have seen these characters grow and change over the course of 5 movies, and now here we are at the 6th one, and everything that they've been through weighs heavily on them here. Spock has certainly changed from his days of being a far more logical Vulcan. He's now died, he's come back, and he's learned to kind of get in touch with humanity, and especially his more human side. And we see that. He's a little bit more presumptuous. We actually get to see Spock pissed off in this film. And that, it's an awesome moment because if Spock is pissed off, how affecting is that? It's one thing to see Kirk get angry and start and lose it. But when Spock loses his shit, that, especially from Leonard Nimoy's acting and his gravitas, that hits home for anybody who watches Star Trek. And then we also get to see Kirk's completion of his character arc, where, in the motion picture, he's taking over the Enterprise again. In Star Trek 2, he gets to meet his son, and he goes from the cycle of feeling older and like he doesn't do anything to feeling young again and having a purpose again, and in captaining the Enterprise. We see him, bring his friend back to life, lose his son, lose his ship. He goes back in time to get Wales and comes back, faces a court-martial, and ends up being redeemed. And then, he totally invigorated. He goes through Star Trek 5. They find God that passes the Great Barrier. And now here he is, after going through all of that, faced with the prospect of everything he knows changing. No more war with the Klingons. And by the way, the opening sequence is still it's one of the best opening sequences. Now, quick side note for those of you who don't really notice these things, and I kind of do. What I liked about the film is that the opening credits, if you notice, each of the little directed by, starring, or whatever, the font changes color as the credits circle. It starts at purple and then moves slowly into blue and then green and then all the way back until it turns into purple again. And I really thought that was really cool. Just thought put into it. But then you've got that explosion at the very beginning. It's so iconic. The Praxis explosion and then the Excelsior. Again, referencing how things come full circle. Sulu in the previous films being so exuberant and excited about the prospect of the Excelsior, and now he's the captain of the Excelsior. It's just touches like that that show like the reverence that they have for the story and the characters and what's come before. And it's not like they're just, putting out a new movie. Insurrection, Nemesis, Star Trek First Contact. There's a special place in my heart for the Next Generation films. But I digress. Anyways, so this is a film about the characters and at the same time about diplomacy. It's a murder mystery. It is, a like tense political thriller. This is not Star Trek that we have seen previously before, and that's another reason why I feel like this is one of the better films, because it branches off into territory that we haven't necessarily explored in Star Trek previously, and yet simultaneously feels very familiar with these characters, with the characterization, where they've been, what they've done, and what their stories have done, culminating in this. The Klingons are looking for a peace treaty. The Federation is willing to give them that. Kirk is pissed, and he doesn't let them die, he says. He can never forgive them for the death of his son, and it's very powerful to hear Kirk, who is normally the guy who says, we need, what can we do? How can we help? He's the guy going, no. He's jaded by his prejudice. He cannot see past his own anger and his own fury over the past and what happened to his son on Genesis, that he doesn't want to go along with this. And Spock presumptuously has volunteered the Enterprise to move forward and be the avatar of diplomacy and peace between the Federation and the Klingons. So it's very interesting to see in this film a Star Trek where Kirk and Spock are not on the same level and are working together, but are at odds with each other. And that is another unique bit about this particular Star Trek. Is that for the first half of the film, Kirk and Spock are actually at odds with each other. They're not seeing along the same lines, which thematically goes in line with the whole peace talks. You've got the Klingons on one hand and you've got the Federation on the other hand, and in the midst of this, in the midst of the entirety of the film, you've got people who don't want to see this peace come through because they're blinded by prejudice, and so they don't see each other, and they don't want to see each other, they don't want to communicate with each other. And so Kirk and Spock, in their own ways, are reflecting that theme because they, too, are at odds with each other at the beginning of the film. Especially up until when, finally, after the dinner sequence where the crew of the Enterprise and the crew of the Kronos 1 have dinner together, just before that initial attack on the Klingons, they're not gelling, they're not connecting, they're not seeing eye to eye, and they're not really trying. In fact, there's a lot of people who are blinded by their own perceptions in this film. It's very thematic, and it carries through very well. I like that we've got Kirk kind of being, put through his paces. And, after Star Trek V, people got that William Shatner vision of Kirk. It was like, very, very Kirk-centric, and he's very exuberant and almost kind of flamboyant. And now to get like a darker, very angry Kirk, it's a nice change of pace. William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, everybody brings their A game in this one. Kirk has a very poignant moment later on in the film where he's thinking about how he's afraid of change. He's talking to Dr. McCoy about it in the sequence. They're on Rura Penthe, and he's talking about how he's been blinded to the idea of change, how he can't seem to fathom the idea of change, and he's wondering if he's too old to be doing this. And it harkens back, again, bringing everything, closing the loop, full circle. It harkens back to Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, in which, he's feeling old and he feels depressed by it, and he stubbornly refuses to move forward in his sense of escalating age. But here in this film, that same thought processes prompt him instead to start seeing things a different way in light of the Klingons and in light of peace, in light of what they're going through and what the Federation and the Klingons can accomplish together. And he starts to begin to see through that, and he starts to be able to put aside the pain of his son's death. It's a very poignant moment. And there is kind of the opposite moment for Spock, because he and Valeris, who is his protege, who he intended to have replace him on the Enterprise, he gets a reversal of that, where he was blinded by his own wishes for this other person, and he didn't quite see where she was coming from, and she didn't quite see where he was coming from. And I mean, spoiler alert, Valeris is one of the traitors. Although that's one of the few things that doesn't quite hold up for me, I guess. Although in a way it does kind of. But I'll get back to that in a moment. But Spock discovers how his own student, who he placed so much trust in, has become a traitor to Starfleet, has betrayed him, has betrayed the Enterprise, and that deep-seated root of anger has taken his hope for uniting these two groups, a kind of an all-encompassing hope, if you will. And he sees it funneled down into how not everybody is going to share that. And it's a very interesting story. You've got two opposites here. You've got Kirk, who is the guy who's like, let them die, and then slowly kind of moving through his prejudice and going, am I too old to be thinking about this? Am I not thinking through this clearly? And then Spock, who very optimistically says, we have to help the Klingons. We need to, promote them. We need to do what we can for them, thinking that everyone's on board. And then he sees truly how there is like such deep-rooted prejudice, even from someone of his own kind who adheres to logic, and that anger, that moment of revelation for Spock is just so powerful when he slaps the phaser out of Valeris' hand, and then when he mind melds with her on the bridge, and he grabs her roughly and he forces her into it. You can see how very little restraint he has in that moment, because he's seeing his optimism and his hope torn down, and how there is a need to fight for equality and for diplomacy and for peace, rather than just going, we can do this together. You have to fight for it. It's two very interesting stories. And everyone on the Enterprise has great moments. I love people. I really like the moment when Uhura is communicating with the Klingons, and they got all the books, and they're trying to like translate and talk back and forth, and they just barely scrape through. And Chekhov has a lot of moments, probably because Sulu's not on the bridge. But Chekhov has a lot of moments, a lot of great lines, and and when we do go to Sulu on the Excelsior, George Takei has some of the best lines in the whole damn film. I still get chills when they're like, when the Excelsior is flying to go help the Enterprise, and he says, "Can we get her to go any faster?" And the guy says, "She'll fly apart," and he yells, "Fly her apart!" Then, and it's just George Takei. Goddamn, that he brought game to this film, and everybody, I feel, brought game to this film. There are a few things that don't exactly ring true. General Chang, while still being one of the most memorable Star Trek villains, to me, incredibly memorable. Shakespearean Klingon dialogue, just like malicious in every aspect. He doesn't really have that much screen time, and he doesn't really have that much of an effect. He's more of like the villain itself isn't really like an actual person so much as it's the intangible form of prejudice, because you've got a Romulan ambassador, you've got a Federation admiral, and you've got General Chang. So basically you've got three people who don't amount to much screen time in total, who represent this conspiracy to assassinate, one, Chancellor Gorkon, and then two, the Federation president. So really, General Chang is essentially kind of a background character, brought more to the foreground by Christopher Plummer's performance. And there is a bit of an attempt to push General Chang more forward into the foreground as an actual tangible villain, but what it really amounts to, as far as screen time and script-wise and thematically, General Chang is the pit bull of the group. He's the guy who just goes for the throat, and you point him in the direction that you need him, and he's kind of like the driving force for the Klingon side of things. But Christopher Plummer's performance and the way, just how deliciously layered and complex. Oh, I love, as a villain, General Chang. So going back and rewatching it, it surprises me really just how much of a more of like a not so foreground character he is. He's really more of a background character who just shows up and does this thing, and in the hands of a lesser actor, he would not have been as poignant. This is one of those films where the casting was dead on and was pitch perfect. Christopher Plummer as General Chang is easily one of the best parts of this film, and the best thing to happen to this film, because he creates the closest thing the script, the film itself, has to an actual tangible villain. He's not up there. He's not even up there necessarily with Nero from Star Trek 09. Simply in terms of screen time and how much leverage the story gives him. You know what I mean? Because Khan had motivations, Khan had drive, Khan had presence and a story and momentum. Nero had backstory, motivation, presence, drive, the whole 9 yards. General Chang, from a story perspective, simply exists and is on that level not nearly as memorable a villain, or not nearly as good a villain, because we don't get a chance to know him, because we don't need to, dictated by the story. We don't know his motivations, aside from the fact that he's a part of this conspiracy that doesn't want to see peace between the Klingons and the Federation. And despite all that, it's Christopher Plummer's performance as Chang that's what elevates the character itself. But if you look at it from that strictly story, thematic, script perspective, he's not nearly as good of a villain. And so that made me sad having that realization, because I've always had Chang in my head as such a great Star Trek villain, but he's just more of a force of nature than anything else. Khan was a force of nature, but he had depth. He had so many rich layers. Chang is nice and complicated, and I mean, and by complicated I mean complex and layered, Shakespearean-wise. But as a villain on paper, strictly speaking, he is not as good a villain as we have been given previously. Better than Kruge, and that's. I mean, again, if you want to talk about villains who in Star Trek have had good performances, but not necessarily any depth or backstory, you've got Kruge, played by Christopher Lloyd in Star Trek 3. And I really like Kruge. I really like Christopher Lloyd's performance. Christopher Plummer he elevates that, be way above, because it's Christopher fucking Plummer. But yeah, just strictly on paper, he is not a very good villain outside of being a force of nature with a cloaked bird of prey. He's got the weapon, and he's got the means to use it, and that's basically all he is. If it hadn't been Christopher Plummer in that in that role, I don't think it would have been as iconic a character that we would have gotten. So they chose well. They chose very wisely. Overall, I really like the story. I really like the murder mystery aspect of it. There's like the revelation of where they find the spacesuits that were worn on the Klingon ship. Considering that they tore apart everything else in the Enterprise, how these things could be, tucked up in a vent in the kitchen that nobody seemed to find them until Scotty found them. It's a little far-fetched. It's a little far-fetched. But that does take me back to Valeris, who, and this is one of the things I didn't get, but then ultimately I kind of forgave. She, very intently leads the search for the gravity boots and spacesuits that were used by the crewmen who went on board the Kronos 1 and assassinated Chancellor Gorkon. And it didn't make sense to me rewatching it. I'm like, why is she taking charge here and is making these assessments, leading forth? She's kind of being the detective. Is it misdirection? And I think it kind of was. That's the only explanation I can come up with for how they missed the freaking bodysuits that were in the vent in the kitchen, and then suddenly the shot. That scene was really too bad. I don't like that where they're like, I found the suits that were used and they belong to these guys who are dead that we just found here. That was contrived, and that's the only scene that I don't really like. But I mean, we had to get things moving forward in the film. So, what else? It's hard to pick at this film because it's just nitpicky stuff. But it's you have to realize nothing is flawless. There's gonna be something wrong with everything. You're not gonna like everything about it. And those, I think, are really my major beefs. Otherwise, the film is just they knew that they needed to go out with not just a bang, but with style and with this is such a great send-off because everybody gets great screen time, everybody gets great lines. The story is solid, a few minor caveats, but the story is solid. It is a great murder mystery. It is a great Star Trek film. It has great character moments. It has great themes. This is a solid 9, which score-wise ties it with The Wrath of Khan. But for as a film, I prefer it just slightly more, and I feel like it is just slightly superior to The Wrath of Khan. With those minor caveats, though, I can't give it a higher score than 9. But I feel good about giving those both a 9 because and ironically or unironically, maybe tellingly, both films were directed by the same guy whose scripts were written by the same guy. So maybe Nicholas Meyer should have been given more Star Trek duties during that time period. It's a thought. But that's my geek review of Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. A lot of fanboy gushing because there's a lot to gush about with this film. It's great. It's a great film. Yeah, I have a couple of problems with it still, but I still think it is the best out of the Star Trek films that were produced featuring the original cast. And it just is grand. And I really, really like it. It's a darker film. It's a slower film. But at the same time, it thinks. And it has a good pace. It is a good running time. It's a little over an hour and a half. It's like an hour and 40 minutes. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It keeps everything moving. And just when you think you kind of got it figured out, something else happens. But now, I've gone through all the Star Trek films. I did it, okay. All right. What's coming up next? I got a request to my geek review Iron Man 3, and that's coming out this weekend. So I'm going to make time to go see that somehow so that I can produce my geek review of that. I'm currently playing through the new Star Trek video game that was released for PlayStation, Xbox, PC. Ah, I'm gonna do my geek review of that. I'm reading Dune. I have a my geek review that I want to do, comparing and contrasting a made-for-TV film and a novel that both carry similar themes, right down to nasty things that happen to the characters, and how one of them is good and the other one is shit. So that's just a quick sneak preview, and of course, Star Trek Into Darkness is coming out. I'm gonna try and not make this a Star Trek centric geek review type of video series. I'm just getting through them now. It's like the glass is sitting there. Let me drink it, and then I'll move on to something else. But you can find more stuff about me, my blog, books, tweeters, all that stuff. And if you want to see me do a My Geek review, leave me a comment or send me a tweet or something like that. Let me know. Let me know if there's anything out there, sci-fi, that you don't want to get a guy to rant at you for like 20-25 minutes for, and just totally geek out about. So that is me. That is my geek review, and thank you for watching.